Now, I think what's happening now is that people are still doing that thing of after 2 or 3 years potentially moving on, but they're going and doing different stuff. So I think now what's happening, instead of going off to an MBA is becoming a lot less popular, I think, from my personal experience and looking at the evidence in the UK. And are going off and doing 2 or 3 years of that profession, but then potentially going off and working in product at a startup or working in a VC, and then potentially going from there to become an angel investor or founding their own company, or joining a founding team. That's kind of the big difference. And instead of going off to do MBAs and learning stuff there and becoming an exec at a big corporate, people are looking more about the startup world as somewhere where you can really learn a lot more, you can grow a lot more, and you can potentially kind of
Hello and welcome back to the House Hack podcast. On today's episode, we're joined by Kabir Bali, who is the co-founder of Jumpstart, which is the UK's only startup graduate program. A 2015 graduate from Oxford University, he has 4 years experience as a strategy consultant at Monitor Deloitte to hand, which he uses to help match London's fastest growing startups with the UK's best graduate talent. How are you doing, Kabir?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Very nice to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure to have you. And of course, you can find Jumpstart at jumpstartuk.com. And today we're talking all about how graduates' careers are changing and what we can do to get ahead of the curve. So probably the starting point is, do you want to explain a bit more about what Jumpstart does and how it helps students and graduates?
Yeah, so I mean, just to sort of take it back to the start in terms of why we decided to set it up. So Matthew and I were both at school together. We then both graduated around the same time, albeit from different universities. And I suppose we both kind of went through that process of applying for jobs and going through that journey of being a graduate or a student to be graduate, and found it quite limiting in terms of the choices that were sort of on offer to us. I think it was very hard to get past the kind of corporate grad scheme. Even if you wanted to, it was difficult to evaluate other options. And there was a lot of sort of social and societal pressure to go down a certain route. And I think as kind of having been at school and university, we're used to sort of having this kind of clear pathway set out for you. And it just feels like the graduate program, or whether it be consulting, finance, banking, is the sort of next step along that journey. And it's quite disconcerting having to apply for a different type of role that's maybe not as well structured. So that's kind of where everyone ends up. But I suppose even at the time we were, Deliveroo and Monzo was starting to be a bit of a thing. I had a few friends who were going off down the startup route and doing these other strange things, and it felt like there was a life outside that we always, in the back of our minds, felt we could potentially get involved in. And then, as you say, I spent 3 or 4 years at Monitor Deloitte, mainly in the digital strategy and sort of innovation and venturing side of things. So we were doing a lot of trying to I guess not copy and pasting, but appropriating a lot of the startup sort of Eric Ries type concepts into large clients and helping them run ventures for them and kind of use the lean startup model as a way of getting to market quicker. And I suppose there was a part of me which felt like, this is great and this is really interesting and I'm working with some interesting companies, but ultimately all these methods that I'm talking about and sort of preaching about, I guess, to clients are really kind of embedded in the startup ecosystem. So surely that's a better place to potentially work out how these things happen. And so Matthew and I actually both were sort of looking into working at startups and just finding the whole process of applying for jobs in that area very, very difficult. We found that the whole ecosystem is very like word of mouth driven. So we felt it was quite inefficient, and we just felt like there wasn't an easy way for graduates or recent graduates who weren't really graduates at the time to get into that market, even though the startup ecosystem is booming. I think there's sort of 10 times more unicorns in the UK than there were 3 or 4 years ago. The ecosystem as a whole, so the incubator, accelerator, VC world is really growing as well. So there's this massive growth. I think there's also a lot of growth within the student market and industry for people wanting to go down more purpose-led careers, so working in startups which have a social impact or are trying to be socially impactful, and also this kind of desire to work in a smaller organization where you have more autonomy. So there was that kind of, both sides of the market was sort of growing, but there was no one that was able to kind of combine the two of them. So that's what we wanted to do with Jumpstart. And so the initial idea was really, we looked at Teach First and saw how they'd kind of elevated teaching and made it into a profession that could get young, smart, hungry graduates into, perhaps in a way that wasn't there before maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I know there's some controversy about Teach First, but ultimately I think they have been quite successful doing that and creating a brand for themselves. So that was the initial idea. So the initial idea was this kind of having this rotations around different startups with training and mentorship and support, which was like a completely ridiculously terrible solution to the problem. And so what we've done now is kind of really refine that and work it into a graduate program, which provides the upfront training. So we train our graduates through a week-long sort of training course, place them with our startups. So we actually get the startups to come in and pitch to our graduates in what we call startup spotlight. So that allows the graduate to understand a lot more about what the company is all about, because job descriptions on paper are very bad at doing that, particularly in a startup where the role can be quite ambiguous. So once they've selected a few startups to interview at from a long list of those presenting, we then help them through that interview process. And then once they've actually landed that job, we actually provide ongoing support. So we'll do things like Matthew and myself be mentors to them. So we talk to them every couple of weeks, see how they're doing, make sure that if they need any extra training or extra connections with people in the industry, we can give that to them. So if they're a marketing person, we connect them with someone who's done marketing for 3 or 4 years to see if there's someone they could talk to get a sense of how to grow their career. We also run events for them as well. So we did one a few weeks back on how to ask for a raise. So, you know, as a graduate 6 months in, how do you have that conversation about asking for a raise? So we had 2 heads of people from startups come in and talk about that. So we run those sort of things. And then as we open up, I guess, with coronavirus, we're doing more social events, sort of, you know, socials and booking out pubs and making sure our community of 50+ graduates can actually get to meet each other and get to know each other.
Awesome. That's a lovely summary. And it sounds like you guys are doing some really, really cool work. But probably just taking it back a second to that step from Monitor Deloitte. I know you said you were working on the lean startup models and you're bringing in a bit of experience with effectively how startups should work, how they should grow, but taking that leap into starting your own thing, like how was that as a journey and what challenges did you face to like leave Deloitte and start your own business?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I can't sort of claim too much adversary because Deloitte and Monitor were really good to me. I mean, I took a career break, so I took 3 months sabbatical back in March. So that was the start of the pandemic. So people thought we were a bit crazy to do this, to quit our jobs and do this during a pandemic. But my company was very good to me. They gave me 3 months off as a sabbatical and said, look, if you want to come back, that's not a problem. You know, give it a go. We're going to support you for that. So that was quite a nice backstop that I always had. And, you know, it wasn't like I was going off to a competitor. So I felt like I had quite a lot of support from that sense. And then obviously doing it with someone else, doing it with Matthew was quite helpful. I think for us, really, we spent a lot of time doing a lot of research before we started. We probably could have spent even longer, actually, but we spent a lot of time building up we had a website already. We'd actually tested it on a number of student jobs boards to see what the kind of uptake was. I think we interviewed, you know, over 100 startups to get a sense of whether this was a problem to solve. So I think that was the thing that in our minds, we knew that there was a problem that needed solving. Like this was quite a big problem from both a graduate and a startup perspective. Graduates couldn't get into startups and wanted to. Startups found it hard to actually access graduate talent, even when they wanted to. So that we gathered a big body of evidence before we actually took the step. So it wasn't like we were kind of, going around in the dark trying to find something.
Yeah, almost like making sure you're making a evidence-based approach to what you're doing and always backing it up as well. It always helps as well when you go and pitch it to people, like, this is why it can work because I've got the evidence and done the research as well, which is really, really good. I think then kind of with that step, with that journey, how does this like impact you're having on young people? Does that align with like your personal mission, if you have one defined already? And like what extent is that realized through Jumpstart?
I mean, I could lie to you and pretend that I have some sort of personal theological vision in my head of what I want to do in terms of changing the world. I don't really. I quite like just solving problems and like coming up with solutions to things and like building something which is like I think is a genuine, like generally does solve that problem, which I don't think actually with Jumpstart we have yet found our product market fit exactly yet. But that for me is what I find quite fun. I like that. I do enjoy that, doing my job as a consultant at university. I mean, maybe that's a bit selfish, but like that's what I enjoy doing. I like trying to solve actual problems and coming up with cool solutions. That's kind of what motivates me more than anything else and gives me satisfaction. I don't really have any personal mission beyond obviously wanting, help people and help the world become a better place. But I think most people would probably say that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's always a useful perspective though, to have that problem solving nature, because it means you can almost do anything as well, just something that you find yourself as being a useful person as. But I kind of add to a bit of a challenge of it. Is there someone in your Jumpstart history of the program that you feel like you've made a huge impact on, that's been a meaningful experience to you, like someone that you maybe took on at an early stage who had that self-doubt and then took them throughout that process and they kind of found their dream role? Like, is there someone that you think really is a shining example of what you do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the people I guess I'm most happy about helping are the ones that maybe weren't really looking at startups, who hadn't really thought about startups as a career before. So, I mean, one grad to just pick out, I'm sure she won't mind, is Charlie Morgan. So she was at Cambridge studying history of art, and I think she'd always wanted to go down the kind of art route or the creative route. And I think literally out of, for whatever reason, threw in an application to Jumpstart, and I guess found out a bit more about the startup world. She was great. She had all the skills we were looking for, and is now at Beam as an ops exec, the kind of very well-known social enterprise company that's doing the waves at the moment. And I think, like, for us, what was nice is that she definitely would never have considered startups as a career. I mean, she thought it was like startups is like this tech bro sort of place where like all these coders sit around in hoodies, and she just had no idea like what a startup was, or the impression and stereotype of it was very masculine and kind of difficult to reach one, and B, one that she didn't think played to her strengths at all. And actually going through the program, learning about the different roles, doing the training week, hearing from all these different startups, I think she just realized actually, every company is a tech company to some extent, right? And actually they're all solving some quite interesting problems that her mind actually is well suited to. So that she's one that's always been that was quite a nice success story for us. I think going right back to the start, Alex Boyle, who was actually at Cambridge as well, and he was kind of on our first cohort, and when we were still kind of really quite green in terms of what the program was, he kind of really backed us and thought that we had something there. And even though we were changing exactly what the program was every 2 weeks, because we got some new feedback that rotations are never going to work, so you can have full-time placements, and this training thing isn't going to work, and XYZ. And he was always very supportive of us, and he's actually now part of our kind of informal board, advising us and helps us along the way. So he's now at third fort in a product manager role, and has been since about August last year.
Nice, love that. And I think you alluded to it a bit earlier as well, but I'd love to dive into it a bit more on the differences between a startup and a corporate environment. So it's something that there's a lot of kind of myths around as well. I'd love to think kind of what are the key differences that stand out for you, and maybe what is it that contributes to that kind of tech bro facade? Because it is a bit of a facade, I think.
Yeah, so I think, full disclosure, I haven't actually worked in a startup. And Matthew, if you ever talk to him, will always claim that he worked at a startup. It was actually backed by Warner Brothers. So I'm not sure how. So in some ways, we're a bit fraudulent because you haven't actually ever worked in a startup. But we've obviously spoken to hundreds and hundreds of them. We've experienced it through our graduates over 50 times now. So we have a pretty good idea of what they're like. And we have done a couple of webinars on this as well. I think in terms of working in a kind of early, the main thing I would say, which is the obvious point, is there is just a lot more ambiguity and responsibility. Like, I was, as a consultant, when I first joined, I think it was probably 8 months before I was allowed to kind of hold a meeting with a client, probably actually even longer than that. Now, if you're working in a kind of commercial role in a startup, it's probably day 2 is the point where you're being thrown in front of a client. Like, you just have to learn by kind of being at the coalface and actually just getting on, and learn by doing, in a way that you don't in a corporate job. And when I say corporate, I'm just comparing it to consulting because that's the only thing I know. So I'm not going to assume things about other corporate jobs, but that would be the main one in terms of responsibility. I think the second is what I'd say is, for us anyway, the companies that we work with, is the ability to actually grow with the company, because you're joining at an early stage, potentially when they've just raised a Series A or a seed stage and they're looking to grow fast. You can quite quickly become a head of X or a senior developer or a senior product manager, because you're actually riding the wave of the company. So some of our firms we work with have started off with 20 people, and actually now 6 months in, they're over 80 people. So imagine being on that 20-man team, 20-person team, and then growing up to 80. You can, if you prove yourself quickly, you can really kind of grow pretty fast. I think the other thing that's quite different is that you're doing something quite tangible. So whether it's in marketing or sales or business analysis, you're like helping build and craft an actual product in a way that kind of the financial services industry or in consulting or banking, you're kind of like supporting everyone, which is important, but you're doing a lot of like building slides and creating theoretical models, but not actually like trying to sell something, trying to see what happens when you throw it to a customer. Do they hate it? Do they like it? What do we change? It's a much more kind of like tangible selling and trying to scale a product, which I think is a really useful skill, which you don't necessarily get in big corporate companies, particularly with consulting and banking. And obviously these are all quite role dependent, but you tend to get more technical skills. So if you're working in operations or a BA type role, you'll learn a lot more about the kind of technical skills that underpin data science in a way that you probably wouldn't do necessarily in consulting, where things are probably still relatively non-technical. There's probably loads of others, but I think those are the kind of main ones.
Yeah, and I wonder your thoughts on foundational skills, because it's a common thought that you need to, or you should go to join a bigger organization before you go to a startup. You know, the kind of classic thing we hear is to get a certain skill level or a certain experience level to then be able to justify maybe the responsibility that you get at a startup. I'm not quite sure, but what do you think to that kind of typical journey of that foundational skills to then go to a startup?
I think, I mean, the main reason why people do it, right, is because if I've got a McKinsey or a Monitor Deloitte or a Goldman's on my CV, that's good like signaling. That's a good signaling mechanism. So it means that when if you're a startup or an organization, you're going through thousands of CVs. That's quite a useful. You know that they're a good company. They hire good people. They probably have reasonably good training. Like, that's a good signaling mechanism. I'm not sure that the content of it is that different to some other places. So, for example, I know that like a lot of people now are putting like ex-Deliveroo or ex-Monzo on their LinkedIn, because actually those companies are now the ones that are seen as the pioneers. So I do think that like people are now respecting the fact that actually working in an early stage startup, you actually have a lot more to talk about in an interview. You're not just talking about like, oh, well, you know, in this project I helped, you know, create this deck, which someone may or may not have seen after 6 weeks of having, you know, spent up until midnight, you know, building it out. Like, you've actually built and scaled the product. You've, you know, maybe sold a new business or created a new feature, or, you know, you've got a lot of tangible experience you can talk about. Yeah, you might not have the signaling mechanism of a big company, but I think under the surface of that, you know, you've actually done stuff which is probably more tangible and you can talk about in an interview than in a bigger corporate. So I think that in terms of the content, that's changing. I think also people, in terms of the perception of startups and the startup ecosystem, that's slightly changing as well. And it's seen as actually, you don't just have to go off to a Goldman Sachs to be seen as a legit person to work in like a VC or work in a fintech, for example. Actually, early stage startup experience is also really, really valuable.
Yeah, and you mentioned that growth of venture capital, of businesses getting from that early stage to that medium stage to even kind of unicorn status. You mentioned a couple there. What are the kind of drivers behind that? Because I think it's something that seems like, to me, from my recent grad perspective, it's like the last 5-10 years that has really contributed to that growth.
Yeah, I think, it's a slightly difficult one, because actually, if you look at the, like everyone says, there's like way more startups now, and I'm sure there are, partly because the VC market and the funding is just there, right? I mean, in terms of the fact that the era of cheap money over the last 10-15 years like has meant that, you know, the VC world with high returns has seen a lot more money pumped into it. The kind of paradox that is, particularly in Europe, is there are very few startups that are actually reaching that kind of, even though there are more and more now, that are reaching that really high growth scale up level. A lot are, compared to the US, where I think a lot of them still do. So I think almost it's a bit of a paradox where I think there's a lot more like money in the early startup world, and it's easier than ever to actually create a company with cloud computing and, you know, existing website platforms and that sort of thing. But actually, that ability to scale to the next level is still quite limited in the UK and Europe. And obviously, if you look at the world as a whole, like the tech industry is still dominated by these massive oligopolistic players. Like, it's not like we've got loads of competition going on at the top. So it's kind of a bit of a, you know, two different stories, I think, going on at the same time.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I guess the thought maybe is going to be for people to think about it within their careers. Do they want to work in a startup, and actually might they ride that wave quickly to an acquisition, to a point where they actually need to leave that startup to keep the startup culture that they like, or the responsibility that they like, because they've almost joined a bigger organization by virtue of being acquired. So it's kind of, again, not something I've experienced personally, but it's an interesting thing to think on what an internal business culture kind of contributes to the reasons for joining a business.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So I think kind of moving on to the next part of the chat, we've already started talking about it, you know, thinking about how graduate careers specifically are changing.
Yeah.
And I think that the best place to start with that is defining where we're coming from before thinking about where we're going. So what does the kind of graduate career of the past look like for you?
Yeah, see, I'm going to slightly be contrarian here. So I actually think that a lot of the a lot of the sort of things that people say, oh, the graduate career is changing and like people are having more portfolio careers and skipping around a lot. It's difficult actually. If you look at in the same way that like it's always nice to create a nice narrative, if you actually look at the data, it's quite complicated. So there's a lot of professions where that hasn't changed for a long time. For example, consulting, the model is for the last 20 or 30 years has been that you do 2 or 3 years and then you go off to a big corporate, or you go and do an MBA, and then you join a big company as an exec. Similarly, in kind of in law, for example, like although people are moving around legal firms more often, they're still staying as lawyers. They're just moving to different firms where they're getting paid more. It's not, so there's a lot of industries that are like not really changing that much. And I remember we did a lot of research on this back when I was working as a consultant. Like, I think the difference now is that graduates or people of the millennial or the latest generation, whatever it's called, they're a lot more interested in other things rather than just money and kind of status on their CV. They're interested in kind of social purpose, like having a good work-life balance, learning like new and interesting skills. So I do actually think that like if companies can offer that, people will stick around. I think it's just that if they're not offering that, people will be more willing to leave. And on top of that it is quite messy. So I think I'm always a bit careful to say that like we're living in this new world where every graduate is spending 6 months in a career and then moving across, and the corporate program is dead. I think it's always more messy than that, than people say it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely role specific as well. I think where there's
exactly.
that trajectory and there's that obvious pillar in terms of how you step up into a senior role, it becomes that it's very hard to break that, especially within professions where it's like medicine or it's becoming a lawyer. Like it's pretty clear in terms of you need the credibility of the time, but actually it's probably with roles where the time isn't the biggest variable. It's more about the skill, the experience, and just kind of going for it, where it becomes quite different. So in terms of the contrary to what you're saying, then where do you think it applies the most? In what roles do you think it is changing?
Yeah, so I think what is changing is it's not necessarily like the structure of the fact that people spend a couple of years somewhere and go somewhere else, but it's the content of where they're going. So I think in the past, you saw a lot, particularly I'm always going to use consulting as an example because that's what I know the best. So this is obviously going to be a very skewed answer in that sense, but that's all I know. So sorry, everyone else who's not a consultant. But what used to happen in the past is that you do your 2 years, do 2 or 3 years. And the same, I guess, we go for like accounting as well and banking to an extent. You go and do that for 3 years. You then go off and do an MBA, and then you like join maybe you join like a big PE firm, or you potentially go and join like a Coca-Cola or a big corporate, and you become a manager in that corporate, and then you hopefully rise the ranks and become a board member or whatever. That was kind of a very typical path of what used to happen. Now, I think what's happening now is that people are still doing that thing of after 2 or 3 years potentially moving on, but they're going and doing different stuff. So I think now what's happening, instead of going off to an MBA, MBA is becoming a lot less popular, I think, from my personal experience and looking at the evidence in the UK, and are going off and doing 2 or 3 years of that profession, but then potentially going off and working in product at a startup or working in a VC, and then potentially going from there to become an angel investor or founding their own company, or joining a founding team. That's kind of the big difference. So instead of going off to do MBAs and learning stuff there and becoming an exec at a big corporate, people are looking more about the startup world as somewhere where you can really learn a lot more, you can grow a lot more, and you can potentially kind of gain the experience and start your own business in an economy or a ecosystem which has a lot more money than it did 15 years ago in terms of VC money and seed money and angel investment.
And do you think that route is changing because the steps to get there in terms of their desirability are changing, or because the outcome itself is changing? So previously you said a board member of, say, a company like Coca-Cola and working your way up. Do you think that's something people now still want, or do you think that's now being replaced with becoming a VC, becoming an entrepreneur, becoming a founder? Like, is that what's affecting the steps, or do you think the steps are still different but are working towards that same outcome?
So when you say the same outcome, you mean people will still eventually want to become heads of corporates eventually, but this is a different way to get there?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Is it? Cool.
I think the steps are changing because people are getting more impatient. I think people aren't particularly enamored by the whole like, okay, I'll spend 10 years working in a corporate and climbing my way up. I think that's becoming less and less appealing. I think the idea of working for a big PE fund again is becoming less appealing because again, it's a large company, you probably have less ownership. I think people like the idea of having a bit more agency, even when they're older in their careers, not just graduates. And startups will give you that. They'll give you that ability to actually work in a smaller team, affect more change, do whatever you want to do, work with exciting new technologies. I mean, ultimately, I think whereas in the past, corporates were potentially leading the way when it comes to implementing new ideas and technologies, that's probably more the other way around, where startups are kind of leading the way in terms of emerging technologies or implementing those new ideas and technologies in a fast way, and corporates kind of catching up. So that's, in terms of where you want to be, that seems to be like a more exciting place. And quite frankly, the money as well. I mean, you can earn quite a lot working in a VC or working in an early stage startup where you've got equity options, and it's pretty lucrative. So I think that's the thing that's also changed.
Yeah, it's almost like taking on that risk and backing yourself as taking part in the startup. The equity part of it, I think, is really interesting as well. Like being on that journey is really, really a big one. And perhaps then with that higher turnover, where it's realized in the certain roles in which we're speaking about, how do employers retain those graduates for the medium to long term? So even if the standard used to be to switch companies, then if it's now switching to different companies faster, the first question being, should they even aim to retain graduates, or is it the sense of do they need to offer different experiences to them to keep them on throughout that medium to long term?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because I think it depends on the type of company. So I think for the big consulting firms, banks, etc., I think they have always had a model where actually churn is built into what they do, because if everyone stayed, then there would be too many partners at the end for them to have an equal size of the pie. So they need to have some churn along the way. I think for kind of, if you're thinking about startups or maybe more kind of scale up startup type businesses which are new in this field of trying to attract graduates, I think the key thing that we've seen, which is a bit of a problem, particularly, I mean, even if you look at places like Deliveroo and Babylon Health, these are big businesses now. They're scale ups, but they have a lot of people, but they haven't had the time to mature as an organization. So they haven't built out those really clear kind of learning and development pathways. So what we've seen is there's quite a lot of churn of people who are 2 or 3 years in because they can't see where they go next, because as you say, it's not the progression lines aren't clear. So I think developing stronger kind of learning and development pathways of where you could potentially end up is really important. And I think startups in particular that have grown really fast, understandably struggle to do that because they spent so long, or a small amount of time scaling from 20 people to 100 people. They haven't had time to really consider how do you create a pathway for someone's career. And I think that will entice people. If you can say, well, actually, you as an individual will grow to this after 2 years, or if you can prove X, Y, Z to us, you can get to this level, and this is the training will help you to get there, and so on and so on. That will help provide employees or graduates with a kind of, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I can see how my career can progress, because I think they can provide a lot of excitement at the start, and the first 6 months is very great because you're trying lots of different things, you're doing lots of cool working operations, working in marketing, whatever it is, but you need to have some sense of, okay, where do I go next? And I think startups, as they do grow into scale-ups, need to be able to invest the time into that. And I think that's always a difficult thing to do when you're so focused on kind of selling a product or meeting investors' needs and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And as people think on that individual level, as they try and plan ahead for what that path might look like, whether it's defined or not.
Yeah.
For you, when does a graduate career come to an end? When does it just become career? Is it 2 years out, 3, 5? Have you changed a couple of times? Kind of what's the line? And I guess, again, it's the caveat is it's different everywhere, but we need to all be talking the same language, right?
Yeah, so I think it's something we've actually talked about quite a lot. So for us, it's sort of when we've interviewed people, it's sort of at the point where when you're thinking to apply to jobs, you wouldn't necessarily apply for the entry level. You'd be thinking of applying at the kind of senior analyst or associate level rather than junior level. I think that's when you stop being a graduate, when you sort of feel like you can apply to not the entry level position. I know that entry level positions at the moment are quite controversial because they seem to still require a level of experience, and probably not worth getting into that whole minefield. But ultimately, it's when you feel, okay, I've got enough experience here to apply for the next level up in a job posting, not the most junior one. I think is basically when you stop being a graduate.
And how far do you think that comes down to skill and just confidence? Kind of what's the paradigm individual should be playing up? Because I haven't got too much data in front of me, but there seems to always be something in the news saying, oh, such and such, you need to just pitch yourself 2 levels above where you think you are, and that's where you'll be. Kind of is it just as much about confidence and skill in that scenario?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's, if you look back on your career and you feel like you've worked in a situation where you have developed a certain like skill set, which is something you've learned over the time of your job, or you've learned a lot about industry that makes you not an expert, but you've got proprietary knowledge. That means that you're no longer entry level and you have either skills or a knowledge of an industry to then add value to an organization. I think that's when you stop being a graduate. I think if you still, so for example, if I was, I'd spent a year doing marketing in an ed tech company, and I then wanted to apply for a business analyst role, I probably wouldn't be able to apply for a business analyst role that requires less than a year's experience, because I haven't done that and I haven't got the skill set or the kind of knowledge to be able to then apply that in a way that wouldn't mean I'd start again. So I think it actually depends where you're going. Whereas if I was to apply to a marketing role, I could say, well, I've done a year of building and scaling this business with the help of SEO management, whatever it is. I've got a set of skills that actually I can then go into that business and kind of from the day one start adding a bit of value. Then I think then you wouldn't be applying for a graduate role. So it depends how those skills you've got match up to the role. So we've seen a few grads actually in our experience who've done like sales for a bit, for six to 8 months, and then they're applying for marketing roles. Now they would struggle probably to apply for a marketing role that's the level above, because they haven't actually got much experience there. They may have the raw skills, so they then have to not take a step back, but take a step sideways in terms of applying for an entry level or a graduate level marketing role.
I think that's really interesting as well, because often the skill sets and the skill stacks combine, so that I'm currently in a position where I feel like I've learned quite a bit about marketing previously throughout university, throughout running the previous business, and now I'm learning a lot about ops and operations. And I feel like combining those two is almost like delivering customer experience on a level of what we're doing. I think that in terms of how I'm feeling, I'm conveying that and putting that forward in the current work we do, is really valuable. But then I also think that almost creates roles for itself. So I don't know if there's something in that for people who have a skill set, say in sales, probably longer than 6 to 8 months, but say it's like 2 years, and then you have 2 years in marketing, and then combine them, maybe client success. I don't know, but they can combine them in a different way and approach it in a different angle. Do you think that's respected and something that they can actually effectively do? Or is that something they have to work on within an organization rather than applying externally?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that makes a lot of sense, and particularly in startups where the role function is like less important and the outcome you're delivering is more important. So like, for example, marketing, like growth is a very popular role that comes up now in startups, which is essentially like a combination of sort of strategic kind of business analysis in terms of like target customer segments and looking at conversion rates, but also kind of the creative side of like what content should we be A/B testing. So it's like a combination of like traditional marketing skills in terms of creating content, but also the kind of data skills needed to look at conversion rates and look at growth patterns and all that sort of stuff. So I think particularly in a startup, there's a lot of those things do combine a lot better. I think, but as a general point, it's about, can you, in an interview or in an application, can you explain that? Can you communicate that added value? That's the key thing. Because if you can say to me, okay, great, you can combine these two skills, and I think in your business, which is doing X, Y, Z, I could actually be really valuable because you need a much more customer-centric approach to your marketing, which is very kind of divorced from the product at the moment. I think that would be, okay, great. That's a lot of added value you can give me. So as long as you can kind of communicate the added value of those two things together, you're in a good place. And I think startups in general lend themselves better to that because they're less like functional. You wouldn't be able to probably do that if you're applying for a big, applying to sort of a Unilever. That probably wouldn't, your experience on both sides wouldn't be maybe as helpful as it would be in a startup where it's all about the customer and there aren't as many silos.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the right way, is how to pitch it, how to combine it together, and how to make a meaningful difference to it as well. I guess with that then, what have you seen as the equivalent with the candidates, with the graduates you work with? Have you seen that they are able to do that and able to pitch themselves? Have you seen that confidence is perhaps the biggest missing thing? Like, what element in terms of their skill set do you work on the most because you find it's missing when they first join you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we actually, although we've talked a lot about roles for the last 10 minutes, we don't focus on roles particularly, because actually for graduates going into startups, like the role titles an operations person at exec at one company can mean something completely different to an ops exec at another company. So we actually just focus quite closely on skills. So in general, we look at actually 5 attributes is what we look for when we're selecting people. So the first is kind of quantitative ability. So how good are you at reading data, understanding data, looking at patterns and information, STEM degree, that sort of thing. So that's one thing. The other is problem solving. So if you're given a difficult problem, big problem, can you break it down into sensible steps that make a logical sense? So that's the second thing. The third is communication, both written and verbal. So can you understand how to tailor a message to an audience, and can you could deliver that in a really, really persuasive way, both in the way you speak and the way that you write. So that's the third, and the fourth one. So the fifth is around kind of feedback. So this is actually an interesting one, which we've developed looking at the data from our applicants. So the ones who've done really successful in our program have been the ones who are basically incredibly humble almost. They're the ones who are the best able to take on feedback and learn from it. So can you display that during the interview process? And that is actually a really strong indicator of success long term. And the last one is just proactivity. So do you have evidence of proactivity through your time at university, through your internships, through the way you answer questions? So those are the broad attributes we look for. And importantly, we don't look for everyone to be a 10 out of 10 in each one, but we do look for people who are particularly good in certain areas. So it's fine to be very, very quantitative and very logical. And it's okay if you're very, very high in those areas, but also not potentially that great when it comes to communication. So we look for people who just have high quotients in certain areas. We don't necessarily look for people who are good or very good in certain areas overall. So that's the first thing to say. I think in terms of skills, yeah, it does depend on the particular graduate, but I'd say the thing that we try and instill, particularly through the initial part of the program, is kind of confidence in how to sell themselves and how to communicate what they've done and what they've achieved, and actually feel like they can do that in an interview effectively, which I think is the one thing that they often lack. They're often just not particularly good at interviewing. And I think it's just something that is maybe practice or is badly taught at universities. I'm not sure what it is, but just the ability to actually structure interview questions, think about how to sell yourself and position yourself. I think that maybe there's a sort of British humbleness about it as well. People are reluctant to say this is what they've done and this is what they achieved. So I think that's actually the biggest thing. I mean, we try and choose great people. I'm not going to lie about that, but I think it's the confidence is where we help them a little bit when it comes to interviews or the interview process.
Yeah, so I wonder what's the main missing piece then, because I guess we're kind of coming at that part of the conversation from two different ways in terms of what you're trying to do differently, but also with what existing companies can adapt around and how candidates can get themselves to a position where they're more comfortable applying or getting to that later stage. So I guess the point for kind of confidence, you've got those 5 things to take away, but also the kind of evidence-based approach of saying, I did this, it got Y out of that thing. I think that's a key takeaway too.
Definitely.
But I wonder what that means for employers in terms of saying how they can adapt their existing graduate program, their recruitment outlook. What can they be looking for to better kind of get their candidates assessed based on those 5? Because I think part of that challenge seems to be that the interview process is the point of failure just as much as the application stage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's why, I mean, I think it's really difficult to answer that in general, because we've developed that framework very much based on what startups look for, and that's a very startup centric approach that we've taken based on the skills that they look for, what we've seen is successful, what are the things that, and again, even then we don't look for everyone to have them. We need to make sure that you have at least a few of them in a high degree, and we try to develop a process which is I suppose not just about the interview, but also about the application. You have a written submission and questions that you have to answer, which are not interview focused. It's not just about the interview in terms of selection of people. But I think for the interview process in general, I think what we've seen and actually applied, who are quite a really interesting firm looking at the behavioural science behind interviewing, is things like tell me a time when you've done X, Y, Z are not particularly effective questions. What you want to try and do is get people to actually practice actual tasks or actual activities that they might actually potentially do in their job, because that obviously is the best way of seeing how they potentially perform, and it's a much more objective way of doing things, because it means that you're actually getting away from the kind of coaching that happens around, and obviously we do that as well, but we try and be quite objective in how we choose people. But in general, I think interview questions that are focused on experience or tell me a time when tend to favour people who've have been privileged enough to go into internships or go and do unpaid work, and as a result have more stuff to say, but actually aren't necessarily the best for the people for the job because you haven't given them actual real world examples. So I suppose the biggest thing would be, actually use tasks that people can go and do, whether it's case studies or situations where, okay, you're at work, this has happened, what do you do in response? Those type of questions are much more effective at actually testing how people think. And again, written questions are quite useful. I think when people speak, biases tend to come into play as an interviewer. So having as many written questions as you can or written submissions as you can is very helpful because it helps reduce that bias and that tendency to go for people who've got more experience because they've had better education, because they've had more money as kids and whatever.
Yeah, no, it's really, really good advice. And to hark back to a point from previously, I think the balance of not having the expectation that those 5 things you have to be sick at all of them, you have to be 10 out of 10 at all of them, is massive for candidates and for grads coming out, because that's almost the perception, isn't it? I think that you get to the end of your uni journey, you've had 18, 20 years, whatever, of education, and you've completed it, and now off you go into the world. Whereas actually the mindset that startups particularly want is that lifelong learner, student mindset, where actually, yes, you've got your own skills where you're really good, you're 9 out of 10 on 2 out of the 5 or whatever it is, but actually you've learned how to learn at uni, and you can come out and you can pick up new skills quickly and apply that, and like Charlie said, skill stack to the point where you can be adaptable, because that's what startups need in that kind of fast-paced environment.
Yeah, I think that's true. The only thing I'd say to that is, I'll actually bring out an example from one of our partners, Quell, which is a kind of gaming and fitness company. Their CEO, Cam Brookhouse, he's at ex-McKinsey, and he told us actually that what they did some analysis on their graduates who'd gone through the whole McKinsey kind of process and had ended up as partners. And actually the things that they were bad at when they were a graduate, they were still very bad at, weren't particularly good at. But the things that they were good at, they were even better at. So, because actually you don't, and I say this a lot to our grads, there's no point, if you're like a brilliant communicator and you're a creative person, like there's not a huge amount of point you going trying to become a software engineer, because you probably will be okay at it because you'll practice it a lot, and that's like great, and you know how to write a bit of code, but you're not going to be brilliant at it. You need to focus on the bits that you're really good at, and that's actually where you're going to end up making the most out of your career and making the most in terms of responsibility and money and all that sort of thing, like being really excellent in something that other people potentially aren't, rather than trying to be like quite good at everything and do courses in XYZ. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but like don't over-index on the things that you're not, like aren't your strengths. Like actually over-index on your strengths, and that's where you'll see the most out of your career. And that's what we try and do with our approach. People who are really, really good communicators, that's what they're good at. Like, okay, make sure you can do a little bit of the other stuff, but like ultimately that's where you're going to be well known for. So focus that.
So like double down on what you're already good at and become great at it, rather than becoming a whole wide generalist as well. That definitely makes sense. I think a really interesting point in terms of like bringing this into current programs and how to compete with the big corporates is the corporates almost do the sourcing of graduates really early. They'll start in September out of a final year student round, and they'll start thinking, okay, we'll kind of attract them now and we'll close applications in January. Like that's loads of leeway for them to start in June. With graduates and with startups, perhaps they're trying to think to hire a lot quicker. But I guess how can we, as a future of the graduate career and the future of the engagement for startups, how can they engage final year students, the best of them, quote unquote, and pick them up early while also remaining adaptable to their needs as a startup as well? Yeah,
I think it's, to be honest with you, it's really difficult for early stage startups to plan that far ahead. I just think it is incredibly like ultimately what happens is you raise a fund, you raise a round of money, a seed round or a series A, and at that point you have the cash to be like, okay, now I need to start hiring ASAP. You can't it's quite difficult to predict that 7 or 8 months in advance. Maybe we'll be in a point in the future when hopefully companies like Jumpstart can be the mechanism which can say, look, you can potentially reserve a place through us on your graduate, as a graduate starting in the following summer, and they can maybe do some initial work experience beforehand. But I think unless there's like a structure for them to rely on in place, I think it's going to be pretty difficult for a early stage startup to do that. Now, I think scale ups like your Monzos and even companies like Wheezy's will probably get to a point where they can start having internship programs in place and therefore kind of pre-select people because they just know they'll be growing and have a steady stream of income and funding coming in. I think until and also actually, I think there's quite a few Y Combinator companies coming out recently that are trying to help a little bit with a sort of internship part, which is like creating a platform for startups to like find students to do work, almost like in a sort of a TaskRabbit type way, but in a much more kind of student-friendly model. So I think that might help in the sense that you can have people in for a summer that can do some work, and you then know their skills and know that they're ready for the job, and you can then hire them the next year. But I think having a program that you can like, as a CJ startup, hire someone 8 months in advance, I think will be very difficult without some external help, just because there's too many uncertainties to commit to that.
And there's also quite a lot of interesting potential solutions to this. Of like, the obvious one that goes in my head is like, why not hire them part-time alongside their final year studies, and then you can try before you buy a little bit. But I guess it's on both sides. The graduate wants security from June, July, but the startup wants flexibility until they can hire ASAP and get it over the line. So like, it's balancing the two of them in a really interesting way as well.
Yeah, I mean, what we see a lot of is actually graduates who've done corporate internships and hated them and therefore applied for us. So, it can also work the other way.
Yeah, definitely. That brings it out as well. You can experience more about what they do as well. I guess this kind of brings us to the future of graduate careers. And I guess kind of hand this back over to you, Kabir. Like, what does the future look like the next 5-10 years? Like, what is the workplace of tomorrow for graduates, and like, how does that look different to how we see it today? And are our assumptions going to be completely changed in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, I think we always over index on change. I think things will probably change less than we think. I think that, firstly, to start with, like the concept of a graduate and university, like, I don't think that a 3 to 4 year university course model, I think it will take a time to change, but I think it definitely like isn't quite right for purpose. Hasn't been for a while. Probably the pandemic has shown that it's like, you don't need to spend 4 years studying like a subject to necessarily have the skills to then go into the workplace. That there is a mismatch there that is clearly, I think, will be addressed, whether it's shorter courses or like a year of a very intensive kind of studying of history of politics and then applying it in a certain way, in the same way that you have industrial placements for some science subjects, whether it's kind of more interdisciplinary courses where you do your history for a year and you actually do like your data science alongside that, or whatever it is. I think that is going to change. So the idea of a graduate will probably change. So you'll probably have people who are maybe younger going into the job market, who have more like appropriate skills, whether it be being able to code or being able to kind of understand how data science works, or how the product lifecycle works, or more like workplace skills. So I think that's probably the first thing that will change. I think secondly, I do think that there is a move. I mean, obviously I'm slightly biased saying this, but I think there is a move away from corporate programs. Like, people are getting a bit fed off with them. I think it's a combination of coronavirus accelerating that as well a little bit. A lot of the graduate programs were cancelled last year. People then found other employment that they probably maybe enjoyed just as much, or have actually found is actually right for them. So that, I think, that like trend, I think will start to accelerate a little bit as well. I think again that I can only see there being more and more VC and startup related money going into the system. So I think we'll see a lot more student founders or student incubators. I think I've already seen a few people, contacting me about these sort of things. So I think you'll see a lot more kind of student type entrepreneurial organizations popping up. I think the startup ecosystem will continue to grow. Whether that actually ends up being more scale ups and kind of unicorn companies at the end, or whether we still have this kind of situation where Google and Facebook buy up every startup whenever they get reasonably big, I don't know. But I think there'll be more and more activity there. I suppose anything else in terms of like actual roles and skills, I think you can already see it with marketing at the moment, in that creative type industries or creative type roles will be supplemented more and more with understanding how to look at data and how to use data to optimize certain things in general. So that's probably my last like point around the roles, I'd say. I think that those are probably the main things. Or my only other caveat is I think things change less than people think. So those things might take a while. It might be like gradual changes along those 3 or 5 dimensions I talked about, rather than like a step change. That often doesn't happen like that.
Yeah, it's always like slow, gradual, and then you look back and it feels like a step change, but actually it's been probably gradual each year to get there as well. And definitely super interesting thoughts across there. And I guess the question to it on this as well would be, what would you want to see from employees and employers to get there? So maybe you've got this ideal picture. I know you're kind of trying to be realistic with it in terms of not overthinking, but how would you want employees and employers to think more about the steps that they can take to get there, and if there are any step changes they can implement along that journey?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I would say from a kind of corporate employer, so I'm going to, because again, I find it hard to talk about the whole employment market because there's so many different types. So to split corporates and employer, so corporates and startups, I think from a corporate point of view, what I think would be a good move would be more things like secondments, or more kind of getting people. So we used to get this quite a lot at Deloitte, and there was a start where people would, you know, spend 3 or 4 months on a secondment, so paid by Deloitte, working in, you know, the civil service or working in industry. And I think there'll be a lot of change using that same model, but maybe working in startups and actually getting your employees hands-on experience of working in small-scale, fast-growing companies that are adopting technology, that are using the, you know, best of practice when it comes to, you know, innovation and the way that they actually run projects and ideas. I think that will be a really positive change, because you almost have this world where the corporate or the consulting firm is kind of, you know, overseeing your overall development and owning your development overall, but allowing you to kind of work quite autonomously in smaller organizations and like getting a bit of a knowledge exchange there. I think that's one innovation I think would be, which is already starting a little bit, which I think would be quite valuable. I think the other would be around, so from a kind of startup perspective, it's actually kind of repeating what I said earlier, but having more of a kind of learning and development mindset around how you can develop graduate careers, and using things like potentially like Jumpstart, hopefully, but Learnably and other kind of platforms that allow graduates to have a pathway that maybe, even if it's a company you can't provide that internally, you can kind of export that to external providers who can provide you with the training that you need along the way, and like a proper pathway that will help you get there. So I think that would be a good step for startups to move towards, and that would help some of the churn I was talking about that the Babylons of this world sometimes find once they're starting to mature as an organization. And then from the flip side, you know, big corporates can start to evolve these sort of secondment models more and more.
Amazing. Really great place to close out today's episode. Kabir, thank you so much for jumping on again. And of course, people can find you on LinkedIn and Jumpstart at jumpstart-uk.com. So we will close the episode off there. Hope you had a good time.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Take it easy.